The 9950 X3D2 sounds absolutely insane on paper. Dual X3D caches on one CPU. But in practice, most games aren't really going to benefit from it, and it ends up performing about the same as a 9800 X3D, and most of the times behind the 9850 X3D. That being said, it's an extremely unique chip, and I think a lot of people are curious to see how it actually performs in Tarkov. So I tested a few different CPU configurations to see what works best. Stock window scheduling versus process lasso with all cores enabled versus locking the game to each CCD individually. And here's how everything played out. For the test configuration, I'm using the 9950 X3D2 on an ASRock X870E Nova with 64 gigs of DDR5 6000 CL30. Storage is handled by an Orico 07000 Gen 4 NVMe. And for the GPU, I'm using a Zotac 5090 Solid to make sure we're not GPU bottlenecked here. For tuning, I'm running PBO with a plus 200 MHz boost clock override and a minus 20 curve optimizer undervolt. U-clock and M-clock are synced at 1:1. F-clock maxes out at 2133 for this chip. SMT is off and resizable bar is enabled. I'll have a dedicated tuning video for the X3D2 soon like my other ones, but I'm still working on dialing it in, so stay tuned for that one. For in-game settings, I'm using my Pure 70 preset. That's my optimized high texture settings. It helps keep good visual quality. It loads the GPU while not maxing it out and ensures that the load is on the CPU. If you want a full breakdown of those settings, I've got my optimization and settings guide linked in the top right and in the video description below. I ran my usual route down Klimov Street into Lexos, first in offline to get baseline numbers, and then online in real raids to see real world numbers. Each test was repeated 3 times. Just keep in mind the FPS numbers here are going to look a little lower than what you'd normally see in an average raid, and that's normal. I'm not trying to show the best case averages. This route is specifically chosen to hammer the CPU so that we can really make a comparison here. In a typical raid, your overall average FPS is probably going to be higher than this. Alright, starting off with Streets Offline. This is just establishing our control to see basically the raw computing power without introducing live players, AI, or network variables. On stock window scheduling, the FPS averages at 143, 1% lows at 116, and 0.1% lows at 107. These are our control numbers, and this is what you'll be getting out of the box. Once we force all cores to be enabled through Process Lasso, the performance is almost identical. Same 143 average, slightly lower 1% and 0.1% lows. So right away that just tells us forcing all cores through Lasso isn't really going to do anything for gaming performance. If anything, it's a tiny step backwards. And that makes sense because the bottleneck for dual CCD AMD chips has always been the interconnect between the two CCDs. And this shows that even though we're running dual X3D caches, the communication between the two isn't fast enough to take advantage of using 2 at a time. So I can see with stock window scheduling, it's parking the second CCD and the game is running off of the first CCD only. Now, after manually locking the game to CCD 1, I did see a small improvement. The average FPS jumped to 146 and the lows came up a bit as well, about a 2% gain. It's nothing crazy, but it does show that manually forcing the workload onto a single CCD does help the gaming performance. But the really interesting results were when I forced it onto CCD 2. This is where we see the biggest jump. We have an average FPS of 150 and about a 4 to 5% improvement across the board for averages and lows. And that's actually a noticeable difference even in an offline run. So as we can see, not all configurations of this chip are equal for gaming. The stock scheduling is fine, the performance was okay, but once I isolated the game to CCD 2, the performance increased and it was smoother overall. And this makes sense because CCD 1 is handling the OS, services, background applications, all that kind of stuff. So pushing the game onto CCD 2 where that stuff isn't happening does result in a little bit of a performance boost in Tarkov. Alright, now moving into the online results. Stock window scheduling comes in at a 128 FPS average with 1% lows at 101 and 0.1% lows at 84. Compared to offline, you can already see the drop, and that's expected with server load and AI now in the mix. When I forced all cores to be enabled through Process Lasso, the performance is, again, basically identical but slightly worse, down about 1% across the board compared to stock. So it's the same story as offline. Unfortunately, forcing both of those CCDs to be working doesn't result in double the performance. And that was what I was expecting, to be honest, after reading that there was nothing done to increase the speed of the interconnect between the CCDs. Now, locking to CCD 1, we start to see a noticeable improvement. Average FPS jumps to 132 with lows also coming up. It's about a 3% gain overall, so it's already a bit more impactful than what we saw offline. But once again, CCD 2 is where things really stand out. 134 FPS average with 1% lows at 106 and 0.1% lows at 92. That's roughly a 5% gain in average FPS and almost a 10% improvement in the 0.1% lows. And that's something you can actually feel in game. It did feel noticeably smoother running on CCD2 than any other configuration. I think it's pretty clear if you're trying to get the most out of the 9950X3D2 in Tarkov, how you run it actually makes a difference. The stock configuration is okay, but running it on CCD2 is going to be ideal for overall FPS and smoothness in Tarkov. Now, in terms of temps and power draw, there are some differences depending on the configuration. Stock window scheduling and forcing CCD 1 through process lasso were the most efficient, giving the lowest power draw and lowest temps overall. On the other hand, forcing all cores pulled the most power, topping out around 120 watts and about 67 degrees. The interesting find though is on CCD2, which ended up being the best performing setup. Power draw was about 10 to 15 watts higher compared to using only CCD1, which lines up with what we were seeing earlier. System processes are likely sitting on CCD1 while the game is fully isolated on CCD2. So you're basically trading a bit more power for better performance and consistency. So at the end of all this, there's a pretty clear takeaway. There's no way to stack both X3D caches together and get some kind of double performance. That just doesn't happen. But what we did see was actually pretty interesting. Forcing the game onto the second CCD consistently gave the best performance out of every configuration I tested. And I didn't think of this angle before testing because on previous dual CCD X3D chips, the X3D cache CCD would also be handling system processes. With the X3D2, you can flip that around. You can run the game on that second CCD and it basically becomes a dedicated 9800 X3D just for gaming, without having to deal with any background tasks. Now going into this, I was expecting similar or maybe even worse performance than a 9800X3D. And I'm not gonna lie, I was somewhere in my heart holding out hope that there would be some way to use both caches together and get a big jump, but that's just not how it works. Instead, what we get is a more controlled setup where isolating the workload actually gives you a solid bump over stock behavior. So it's a pretty cool result. If you're running a 9950X3D2 for Tarkov, it's definitely worth using process lasso and locking it to that second CC because it will make an actual difference in your performance and game feel. Alright guys, that's all I got for this one. Hope it was helpful. If it was, please drop a like and subscribe. I've got more testing coming for this chip, including deeper tuning and comparisons against the 9800X3D and 9850X3D. If you guys want to see anything else, feel free to let me know in the comments or join my Discord and hit me up. My name's Puri. I'm always down to chat. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.